In this video, we're going to start talking about trigonometric functions of any angle. So right now we've held our discussion to angles between 0 and 90 or in quadrant 1. Now we're going to see what happens if we move outside of quadrant 1. And the first thing we should recognize is if we're talking about this angle theta here, the sine of this angle is y over r, or opposite over hypotenuse. The cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, or x over r. And tangent is opposite over adjacent, or y over x. So the sines of y and x are actually going to determine the sines of our trig functions. And the y and x sines are determined by which quadrant we're in. So right now we've only seen positive values because in quadrant 1 x and y are both positive. But as we move to quadrant 2, 3, and 4, the sines of x and y change, the sines of our trig functions can change as well. So there's a summary of how to write the rules using, instead of opposite over hypotenuse, opposite becomes the y, and hypotenuse is r. R is always positive because it's the distance from the origin to the point xy. We find it using the Pythagorean theorem, so if you think about it, r is always going to be equal to the square root of x squared plus y squared. And so when you take the square root of two squared values, the answer is going to have to be positive. So r is always positive. So we only need to figure out the sines of x and y to figure out the sines of our trig functions. So in quadrant 1, where both are positive, everything is positive. In quadrant 2, x is negative. Well, what does x affect? Well, x affects this cosine, so that means cosine is going to be negative here. Tan also has an x in it, and a y, and the y is positive, so a positive and a negative makes negative, so tan is going to be negative there as well. Y over r, well, y is still positive, as we can see here. R is always positive, so positive and positive means that sine is the only positive value in quadrant 2. We noted that all things were positive in quadrant 1. And if we go through each of these quadrants, we can tell that the ones that have x as negative, well, that's going to have cosine as negative. If y is negative, so that would be 3 and 4, sine is going to be negative. For the case of tan, since it has both x and y, if the symbols are the same, like in quadrant 1 or quadrant 3, then tan is positive. If the signs are different, quadrant 2 and 4, tan is negative. So we can see a summary of that here. An angle will have a positive cosine where x is positive. That's first and fourth quadrants. Negative when x is negative. We'll have a positive sine when y is positive, and that would be quadrants 1 and 2. And negative where y is negative. And tangent will be positive when y and x, so both the y and x coordinates should be written there, and x coordinates have the same sign, and that's first and third quadrants, and negative when they have different signs. So we can see in these diagrams here, quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4, all things are positive in quadrant 1, sine is positive in quadrant 2, tangent or tan is positive in quadrant 3, and cosine is positive in quadrant 4. So it's a good idea to sketch this on the top of your page when you go to start a test, ASTC, so you're reminded of which trig functions are positive in which quadrants. And we'll do two quick examples to finish off this video, and we're going to determine if we have a positive and a negative sign based on which quadrant the angle is in. So for the sine of 20, well, that 20-degree angle is in quadrant 1. And over here, we're just going to sketch the diagram from before. So all things are positive, sine is positive, tan is positive, and cosine is positive. So 20 in quadrant 1, well, all things are positive, so the answer here is positive. The sine of 200, 200 is quadrant 3, sine is negative in quadrant 3. Quadrant 3, only tan is positive, so sine must be negative. Tan in quadrant 1, 20 is in quadrant 1, so that's positive. 343 is quadrant 4, so that's negative. Quadrant 4, only cosine is positive. Cosine of negative 120, well, remember, negative means we start and go backwards. So this would be negative 90, negative 180, so it's somewhere between those two, so it's in quadrant 3. And quadrant 3, we have tan is positive, so cosine is negative. 210, well, that's also quadrant 3, so we're still negative for cosine. Negative 150, that is also quadrant 3, but tan in quadrant 3 is positive. We'll finish with example 2 then. And in example 2, we're given two pieces of information. So in this first one here, we're told the sine of theta is positive and tan theta positive or greater than 0. That means positive. So where can both of those things be true? Well, sine is positive in quadrant 1, so we'll write sine theta, and in quadrant 2, sine theta. So they're positive in both of these. Tan theta positive, well, that happens in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. So the only quadrant where both of these things are true is quadrant 1, so the answer has to be in quadrant 1, because that's the only location where both sine and tan are both positive. In the next example, we have secant, and we didn't show the rule for secant, but if a number is a negative, then its reciprocal must also be negative, so this means that cosine theta is also negative. And we're missing a piece of information here. That shouldn't just say sine, it should say sine of theta. So let's get rid of that. Let's fix that. So that's sine theta less than 0. So we have cosine negative. Cosine is negative where x is negative, which is quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. Sine is negative where y is negative, so that's quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So the only common place that can happen is in quadrant 3. So we'll finish these two. Cosecant, well, we can think about sine. So sine is positive in quadrant 1 and 2. Cotan, so we think about tan, and tan is negative in quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. So the answer then, where both things happen, is quadrant 2. The final example, we have cosine positive, so that happens in quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Cosecant, that's reciprocal of sine, so we think about sine being less than 0, and that happens where y is negative, or in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And so the answer for this one must be quadrant 4. That's the end of this lesson. Remember, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, come see me, write me an email, ask in class, but make sure you understand what you're doing, and we'll see you in the next lesson.